The legacy of these missions extends far beyond their immediate military impact. They demonstrated that in modern warfare, no sanctuary is truly safe. No distance too great for determined adversaries to cross. The shocked Japanese pilots who first encountered Mustangs over their homeland were witnesses to a new era. An era where global reach and technological superiority would reshape conflict itself. As the last Mustang formations departed Japanese skies in August 1945, they left behind more than military defeat. They left a transformed understanding of aerial warfare possibilities. The age of the invulnerable homeland had ended. It was replaced by an era where the entire world became a potential battlefield. But let's go back to where it all began. April 7, 1945, high above the Japanese home islands, veteran pilot Lieutenant Commander Iwao Nakamura squints through the morning haze. He searches the sky for familiar silhouettes of American B-29 superfortresses. For months, these massive bombers have been pounding Japan's cities. They come with devastating regularity. But today, something is different. Nakamura's radio crackles with urgent reports from other Japanese fighters. The Americans aren't alone. Escorting the bombers are sleek silver fighters unlike anything the Japanese have seen over their homeland. Long-nosed, graceful, and fast. Faster than anything in the Imperial Japanese Navy's arsenal. As one of these mysterious fighters banks toward him, Nakamura realizes with growing dread that everything has changed. The war he thought he understood has just taken a dramatic turn. The Americans have brought their most lethal fighter to Tokyo, the P-51 Mustang. Years earlier, the P-51 Mustang's path to Japanese skies was neither straight nor obvious. Originally designed for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, the aircraft initially struggled. It had mediocre performance at high altitudes. It wasn't until North American aviation married the airframe to the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that everything changed. The Mustang transformed into perhaps the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. In European skies, Mustangs had already earned their reputation. They served as bomber escorts and dogfighters. They could fly from England to Berlin and back, a range that seemed impossible for single-engine fighters. But the Pacific presented challenges that dwarfed anything seen over Europe. The distances were staggering. The weather was unpredictable. A single engine failure over the vast Pacific meant almost certain death. By early 1945, the brutal mathematics of Pacific warfare told a grim story. Japan was a nation under siege. Its cities burned night after night under relentless B-29 bombing campaigns. The capture of Iwo Jima had provided the USAF with a crucial stepping stone. P-51 Mustang fighters of the 7th Fighter Command could now be stationed on that blood-soaked island starting in March 1945. This single development would fundamentally alter the air war over Japan. When American strategists began planning the final assault on Japan, they faced a sobering reality. B-29 bombers flying from the Mariana Islands were taking horrific losses. The bombers' own defensive guns weren't enough. No American fighter had the range to escort them all the way to Japanese targets and back. The answer came with very long-range missions. P-51 Mustangs based on Iwo Jima would begin flying on April 7, 1945. These missions pushed both aircraft and pilots to their absolute limits. They required approximately 8 hours of flying time over mostly empty ocean. For Japanese fighter pilots, the war had been a steady descent into desperation. The legendary Zero fighters that once dominated Pacific skies were now obsolete. They were outclassed by newer American aircraft in every meaningful category. Fuel was scarce. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The quality of aircraft rolling off Japanese production lines was declining rapidly. Material shortages were everywhere. Yet Japanese pilots retained one crucial advantage. They were fighting over their homeland. Short flight times to friendly airfields, familiar terrain. American bombers flying from distant bases could only be intercepted during the brief windows. The Japanese had learned to husband their remaining strength, strike quickly and melt away before overwhelming American numbers could be brought to bear. All of that changed when the first P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Iwo Jima's hastily constructed airstrips. From Japanese airfields scattered across Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, veteran pilots watched the daily processions of B-29s with grim familiarity. They had developed tactics for dealing with these raids. Hit hard, hit fast, then escape before the bomber's massive defensive firepower could concentrate. Intelligence reports had warned of American fighters operating from Iwo Jima. But many Japanese commanders dismissed these as exaggerations. After all, what single-engine fighter could possibly fly 650 miles from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and still have fuel for combat and the return journey? The very idea seemed to violate the basic laws of aerodynamics. Starting in late 1943, Japanese pilots had encountered P-51 Mustangs in other theaters. Despite some early successes, it quickly became evident that the new fighter was a deadly opponent. But those encounters had been fleeting, usually over distant Pacific islands where the stakes were lower. Now intelligence suggested these same aircraft might appear over the sacred home islands themselves. Japanese aviation engineers studied captured documents and wreckage. They desperately sought weaknesses in the Mustang's design. What they found was troubling. An aircraft that seemed to have no significant vulnerabilities. It combined speed, range, firepower, and maneuverability in ways Japanese designers had thought impossible. Dawn broke clear over Japan on April 7, 1945. Mount Fuji stood sentinel in the crisp morning air. As 91 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approached their rendezvous point, pilots saw their ultimate objective for the first time: the Japanese homeland. The weather was clear, and we saw the coast of Honshu and old Mount Fujiyama standing out just like it did in the pictures, recalled Major Jim Van de Hey. He was CO of the 78th Fighter Squadron. For American pilots, this moment represented the culmination of years of island-hopping warfare. They were about to become the first single-engine fighters to escort bombers over Japan itself. A milestone many had thought impossible just months earlier. But for Japanese fighter pilots scrambling to intercept this unprecedented threat, the sight triggered profound psychological shock. These weren't the familiar lumbering bombers they had learned to fight. These were sleek predators clearly designed for one purpose: air-to-air combat. The Mustangs soon formed up with their charges. 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing. "It was quite a spectacle," said Captain Art Bridge. The formations stretched for miles across the sky. A demonstration of American industrial and logistical capability that left Japanese observers stunned. American Mustang pilots, many barely out of their teens, carried the confidence of a nation transformed. Their aircraft were products of assembly lines producing thousands of fighters per month. Their leather flight jackets concealed chocolate bars and cigarettes, luxuries that had become distant memories for most Japanese civilians. In stark contrast, Japanese pilots flew aircraft increasingly cobbled together from whatever materials could be found. Aluminum had given way to wood and fabric in many components. Fuel was so precious that training flights had been reduced to bare minimum. This left many Japanese pilots woefully unprepared for combat against experienced American aviators. The psychological dimensions of this encounter went beyond mere tactical considerations. For Japanese pilots raised on concepts of Bushido and national invincibility, the appearance of enemy fighters over the homeland represented a fundamental violation. Everything they had been taught about Japan's natural defenses was crumbling. As the two forces converged over central Honshu, radio frequencies erupted with frantic communications. Japanese ground controllers vectored their fighters toward the incoming threat. American bomber crews called out enemy positions to their Mustang escorts. Pilots estimated 75-100 Japanese fighters rose to meet the challenge that day. The resulting air battle was fierce and decisive. American pilots claimed 21 enemy aircraft destroyed while losing only 2 Mustangs. The disparity in these numbers tells a story of technological and tactical evolution. The Mustang's superior speed and climbing ability allowed American pilots to engage on their own terms. They could dive on Japanese formations and escape before effective countermeasures could be organized. The P-51's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Its long range meant pilots could afford to spend fuel in high-speed maneuvers. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft often inferior in every measurable category, found themselves fighting a new kind of air war. The hit-and-run tactics that had served them against unescorted bombers were useless. These fighters were specifically designed to hunt other fighters. Major James B. Tapp emerged as the star of that first engagement. He claimed 4 enemy aircraft destroyed. His success, multiplied across dozens of other American pilots, represented a new chapter in the Pacific Air War, one in which the homeland itself had become a battlefield. As smoke cleared from that first engagement, both sides began to grasp the implications. For American strategists, the mission proved their most audacious operational concepts could work. Single-engine fighters could indeed escort bombers all the way to Japan and back. But the psychological impact on Japanese forces was perhaps even more significant. Reports of the air battle rippled through Japanese military channels. They carried the sobering realization that American air power could now operate with impunity over Japan itself. For Japanese commanders studying intelligence reports, one fact emerged with crystal clarity. Everything they thought they knew about defending Japan had just become obsolete. The Americans had brought their best fighters within range of the most important targets in the Japanese Empire, and there seemed to be no effective way to stop them. In the weeks following that first shocking encounter, the skies over Japan became a deadly theater of escalating aerial warfare. What had begun as an experimental mission to test fighter escort feasibility had transformed into a sustained campaign. From their volcanic island base on Iwo Jima, American Mustang pilots flew mission after mission. Each sortie pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in single-engine fighter operations. 8-hour flights over endless expanses of ocean, navigation by compass and dead reckoning, with nothing but water between takeoff and the Japanese coast. For Japanese pilots and their commanders, each American raid brought new revelations about their enemy's capabilities. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture. Not only could American fighters reach Japan, they were arriving in ever greater numbers, with seemingly unlimited resources behind them. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical damage. Japanese civilian morale, already strained by months of B-29 raids, plummeted further. Word spread that enemy fighters now owned the skies above their homeland. Faced with this new reality, Japanese military leaders scrambled to adapt. The few remaining experienced pilots were pulled from training duties. They were thrown into combat. Aircraft held in reserve for the expected American invasion were pressed into immediate service, despite critical shortages of fuel and ammunition. Japanese engineers worked frantically to develop new tactics and technologies. Ramming attacks, once considered desperate measures, became standard operating procedure. Pilots were trained to use their aircraft as weapons when conventional armament proved insufficient. The quality of Japanese aircraft continued to deteriorate as the industrial situation grew more desperate. Critical materials like high-grade aluminum were replaced with whatever could be found: wood, fabric, even bamboo in some cases. Engines ran on increasingly poor quality fuel. This reduced performance and reliability when pilots most needed their aircraft to function flawlessly. Yet despite these overwhelming disadvantages, Japanese pilots continued to rise and fight. Veterans like Flight Petty Officer Kanio Shimoto, flying the new Kawanishi N1KJ George fighter, managed to score victories against the seemingly invincible Mustangs. Such successes, though rare, provided precious morale boosts to a fighter force rapidly approaching the end of its operational capability. Meanwhile, the toll on American pilots was beginning to show. The very long-range missions demanded everything a pilot could give: physically, mentally, and emotionally. Flying for 8 hours in a cramped cockpit, much of it over empty ocean, tested even the most experienced aviators. A single mechanical failure meant almost certain death. Captain Robert W. Moore of the 21st Fighter Group later described the psychological pressure. "You're alone out there for hours, nothing but water in every direction. Your engine could quit, your navigation could be off by just a few degrees, and you'd never see land again. It got to some of the guys." The logistics of these missions were staggering. Each Mustang carried maximum internal fuel, supplemented by external drop tanks. These were jettisoned once empty. Even with these modifications, pilots arrived over Japan with fuel margins so tight that any unexpected combat maneuvering could prove fatal. Ground crews on Iwo Jima worked around the clock to keep the Mustangs flying. The volcanic dust of the island played havoc with precision engines. It required constant maintenance and filter changes. Spare parts had to be flown in from bases thousands of miles away. June 1, 1945, would forever be remembered as Black Friday among pilots of 7th Fighter Command. On that day, 148 Mustangs from 3 fighter groups departed Iwo Jima to escort B-29s to Osaka, the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups. The mission began ominously. Weather reconnaissance reported massive cloud formations over the target area, but the strategic importance meant it would proceed regardless of conditions. As the formation approached Japan, pilots found themselves flying into weather that would test every limit. The Mustang formations became separated in the massive cloud system. Individual flights were scattered across hundreds of miles of sky. Navigation became nearly impossible as pilots flew blind through towering cumulus clouds. They relied on instruments and training to maintain course. Pilot Lawrence E. Grennan was among those forced to bail out, though he was fortunately rescued by the U.S. Navy. But many others weren't as lucky. The combination of severe weather, fuel exhaustion, and navigational errors claimed multiple aircraft and crews. The irony was bitter for American commanders. After months of successful, very long-range missions, it wasn't Japanese fighters that dealt the most devastating blow. It was the weather itself, an enemy that no amount of firepower or tactical skill could overcome. From Japanese airfields and radar stations, operators watched with amazement as American aircraft disappeared from their screens one by one. Not from combat, but from treacherous weather conditions. For Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to feeling helpless against overwhelming American technical superiority, Black Friday provided a sobering reminder. Even their enemies were subject to forces beyond their control. By mid-1945, the appearance of American fighters over Japan had implications reaching far beyond individual air battles. P-51s had dominated air combat in Europe, destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft. In the Pacific, P-51s flying off Iwo Jima escorted Boeing B-29 Superfortresses on their way to bomb Japan. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian morale was profound. Citizens who had been told that divine winds would protect their homeland now watched American fighters roaming freely overhead. The myth of Japanese invulnerability, carefully cultivated by years of propaganda, crumbled as enemy aircraft appeared in skies that were supposed to be inviolate. Most critically, the presence of long-range fighters fundamentally changed the strategic calculus for both sides. American bombing missions could now proceed with greatly reduced losses. Japanese forces found themselves fighting a war they could not win through conventional means. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments lay countless individual stories of courage, loss, and human drama. American pilot First Lieutenant Marcus McDilda became one of the few Mustang pilots captured by Japanese forces when he was shot down during a mission over Kyushu. His interrogation revealed the extent to which the Japanese military was struggling to understand American capabilities and intentions. On the Japanese side, pilots like Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, found themselves fighting an entirely different kind of war. The veteran pilot, who had survived countless combats across the Pacific, later wrote about the profound shock of seeing American fighters over the homeland itself. These personal accounts reveal the human dimension of a conflict that had become as much about national psychology as military strategy. Young men on both sides, products of vastly different cultures and military traditions, found themselves locked in combat over the ancient islands of Japan. By July 1945, organized Japanese fighter resistance had largely collapsed. The combination of fuel shortages, pilot losses, and industrial disruption had reduced the once proud Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Force to shadows. The few remaining Japanese pilots found themselves flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming numbers of technologically superior opponents. Success was measured not in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in whether the pilot survived to fight another day. American Mustang pilots, meanwhile, had shifted from primarily escort duties to fighter sweeps and ground attack missions. With Japanese air resistance minimal, the focus turned to destroying the remaining elements of Japan's war-making capacity. In preparation for the planned invasion of the home islands, the transformation was complete. Skies that had once been defended by thousands of Japanese fighters were now the exclusive domain of American aircraft. The Mustang's appearance over Tokyo had indeed stunned Japanese aces, but the shock had evolved into grim recognition of inevitable defeat. The very long-range missions flown by P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima represented more than just tactical innovation. They embodied the transformation of American military capability from a regional power to a truly global force. The ability to project fighter strength across the vast distances of the Pacific demonstrated logistical and industrial capabilities that no other nation could match. For Japanese aviators who survived the war, the memory of American fighters over their homeland became a defining moment. Many later wrote that seeing Mustangs in Japanese skies was when they truly understood the war was lost. The missions also revealed the human cost of pushing military technology to its absolute limits. American losses were 91 pilots killed and 157 Mustangs destroyed during these extended operations. A sobering reminder that even the most advanced equipment could not eliminate the fundamental risks of combat aviation. The story of Japanese aces stunned by America's P-51 Mustang over Tokyo is more than just a tale of technological triumph. It's a human story about adaptation, courage, and the profound psychological impact of warfare in the modern age. The Mustang's appearance in Japanese skies marked the moment when the home islands themselves became a battlefield. It shattered the last illusions about Japan's natural defenses. For pilots on both sides, it represented the final chapter of an air war that had begun at Pearl Harbor. Now, it reached its climax in the skies above Mount Fuji. The young pilots who flew these missions, both American and Japanese, carried memories that would last a lifetime. Memories of a moment when the future of warfare was written in contrails across the sky above the land of the rising sun.